Germany, so we would like to start. And hello and a very warm welcome to today's DAAD Climate Lecture Series. Schneider. I'm head of the section Transnational Education Projects and Cooperation Programs in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America at DAAD Bonn headquarters here in Germany. And on behalf of the German Academic Exchange Service, I would like to welcome you all. First of all, I regret to inform you that Minister Vélez Torres had to withdraw from today's lecture due to unforeseen circumstances, and we apologize for any inconvenience, but of course we would all have been pleased to hear her speak. However, we are really happy to have found an excellent alternative speaker today. Professor Pao-Yu Oei will address the same topic as the minister, focusing more on the scientific and the political perspective, while still covering the transition away from fossil fuels. So thank you, Pao-Yu, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for stepping in on such a short notice today. Before we start with the lecture, I would like to give you some background on the lecture series, which is organized by the Global Centres Climate and Environment Program. DAAD founded the Global Centres Program in 2021 in context of the climate crisis and with the purpose on focusing on global challenges. And the aim of the program is to contribute to the generation, transfer, and circulation of knowledge on climate and environmental protection. And to this end, the program supports international cooperation between German universities and universities in the Global South, which work together in research and teaching and strive also to disseminate the knowledge gained to society. And in total, in the climate centers line, a total of 4 centers are funded with funds from the German Federal Foreign Office, all of which deserve the title of global centers and so far, as they are based at least 2 countries of the Global South and in Germany, and have at least 3 hubs. And if you would like to find more about the centers and the program, which also includes the 4 centers on global health and pandemic preparedness, you find also the link to the program's website in the chat. My colleagues posted there. And before I give the floor to today's chair of the session, Grace Quinceno-Soto from the Global Centers for Climate and Environment Projects will also introduce our speaker today. I would like you to provide with a few organizational notes on today's sessions. Your microphones and cameras are all switched off and will remain so for the entire event, and you can ask questions at any time via the chat of the event, and we will collect them and post them to Pao-Yu after the lecture and the Q&A part of the session. The recording of the session has already started, and the recording will be published on the DAAD channel on YouTube and on our website. So I'm very much looking forward to our lecture today. And Grace, the floor is yours now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Petra, for the introduction. And I'm Grace Quinceno, Petra already mentioned, the academic coordinator of the Transnational Center for Just Transitions in Climate, Energy and Sustainability. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dr. Pao-Yu Oei. He's a full professor for economics of sustainable energy transition at Europa-Universität Flensburg, and he's directing the master's program in sustainable energy. He's also the head of the research group Fossil Exit. He's a research guest at the Technische Universität Berlin, DAW Berlin, and a spokesman for the Interdisciplinary Institute for Environmental, Social and Human Sciences at Europa-Universität Flensburg, and member of the Center for Sustainable Energy Systems. Professor Oei uses his expertise to advise various local committees on energy and climate topics. In addition, he is the head of the Transnational Center for Just Transitions in Energy, Climate and Sustainability Projects, and he's also supervising around 15 PhD students in various interdisciplinary topics on just energy transition topics. So I'm very happy to welcome you, Professor Oei, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for the kind words and introduction, and a warm welcome also to everyone who's joining us today, whether you are basically based in Europe or the African continent, and it's around midday, or if some of you might be from Latin America, very early in the morning, or more later in the evening, basically more on the Southeast Asian part of the continents. So I first of all also want to apologize that Irene cannot be with you. So I would have loved to hear the minister speak. Nevertheless, I'm happy to speak on her behalf on this topic, as I have been working on this topic now for probably 15 years and working on coal phase out in Germany, in Europe, but also for more than 10 years now in Colombia. And I have been in Colombia during the transition away from fossil fuel conferences that took place a couple of weeks ago in Colombia, and therefore I think I will be relatively well able to give you a perspective. It's me coming from the academic sphere, from a university. It's more the academic perspective on what science tried to tell political decision makers in Colombia on how to manage such a transition away from fossil fuel, meaning coal, gas, and oil, to renewables, and how to do this in a just way. My focus is a bit more on the scientific elements behind it, but at the same time, it is of course linked to the political perspectives of what are the political recommendations, what are the targets that political decision makers in Colombia then took from there, and what happened with these recommendations within the last weeks, basically, as there were a lot of different talks and a lot of different reports were published. And my aim basically of today's lecture is to guide you a bit through the process of the last 6 months, more or less. What has happened, what was recommended by whom, what was adapted by whom, and what are we expecting for the next months to come on this topic. So this is basically my talk and my perspective. Before we start on what happened in Colombia this year, I think we need to go a step back, or a step meaning 3 years back, to the COP28 in Dubai, when it was one of the first times that we were at least able to hear the terminology, let's transition away from fossil fuels, within the COP documents. We have to be aware that the climate target of 1.5 degrees centigrade was ratified in Paris already in 2015. So we were everybody online that we want a climate target, but we were never really honest before that to say, what do we have to do to reach this climate target, which is phasing out fossil fuels. So all the years between 2015 and 2023, we basically never really mentioned the topic of, okay, we really have to phase out fossil fuels. And in 23, it was one of the first times that there was at least able to reach a consensus to frame it as transition away from fossil fuel. Realize it's not speaking about a fossil exit, but a transition away, which is a narrative that some countries, especially India and China, pushed, which is a bit less strong and gives a bit more room for interpretation about the speed. It also gives some interpretation about the usage of carbon capture and storage. So therefore, it's a bit weaker than something that I would have preferred, like a fossil exit, but it's a right step into the good direction. So this was in 28. For the next years, we had then hoped that this transition away from fossil fuels would not just be a political statement, but that there would be clear targets. And some of us at the COP30, basically last year, were a bit not so much satisfied with the outcome in Brazil, because the topic was not mentioned that strongly anymore. And due to this discussions, it was then in the end Colombia that basically intervened in one of the last formats and basically stated that what COP30 was proposing to agree on is not sufficient to meet the climate crisis. Therefore, then Colombia announced, together with the Netherlands, that they want to host another conference in 2026 in parallel to the UN COP conferences, which should basically focus specifically on the topic on how to transition away from fossil fuels. So this was planned from 2025 onwards, with only half a year basically of planning how to and where to basically host this conference exactly. And this was before geopolitical tensions in 26 became even more dramatic. We had the war in Iran that is actually still happening, where we saw also oil and gas prices skyrocketing. We saw basically the discussions regarding OPEC and if OPEC might fall apart at some point, with the first members leaving OPEC now in the last weeks. And within this context then, with gas prices being relatively high and countries being more aware that depending on fossil fuels is a geopolitical risk, it was Colombia and the Netherlands which basically hosted this conference in the end of April in Santa Marta. Santa Marta being a smaller city in the Caribbean coast of Colombia. It was based in Colombia, but the Dutch government helped in facilitating some of the conference parts. The Dutch government was present with a huge delegation, so it was co-hosted by 2 countries, even though it physically only happened to take place in Colombia. Why do we need such a conference? One of the reasons why there's a necessity for such conferences is that the COP conferences by itself, from my personal opinion, are not sufficient anymore to basically meet the stringent need of decarbonizing our energy sector. We have seen in the last years that the big UN COP conferences are an important possibility for actors to meet, but they've become too big, too global. There has been too much power by fossil industries basically capturing these events. We have seen that especially countries hosting the conference that were not so much keen on climate strategies were providing challenges with respect to the stringency of real recommendations to meet the climate crisis. And therefore, there was the wish from some people to form a kind of additional format for a coalition of the willing. So a format where not everybody joins, but only those that are really interested in basically finding a solution for the challenges that we are facing. And therefore, there came the idea of forming such a multi-event, which is more oriented towards solutions and not just talk, but basically also forming actions and knowledge sharing between those actors willing to basically decarbonize the system. It was within this format that in the end, more than 50 countries came to Colombia with different delegation sizes. And these countries were from many different parts of the world. And sorry, is this connection issue? So basically people came from many different parts of the world. And there was delegations not only from the political agenda, but also people. Sorry, I think my connection just broke off. Let me fix this.
We can still hear you.
Okay, so let me just, I'll keep on talking, and in the meantime, I'm trying to continue the connection. So this was people coming from the political spectrum, but we also had people coming from academics coming. We had civil society representatives joining. We had people coming from different continents, even though that, honestly speaking, it was quite difficult due to the crisis of fuel costs and making it more challenging. African continent as well as from Asia to the Latin American continent. And the conference therefore connected especially those countries that were willing to act, and therefore we had a stronger share of countries that were less fossil fuel dependent. So those countries which used to block COP negotiations in the last decades, such as Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, but also the US, were not present, but it was therefore this terminology that I termed as coalition of the willing, those willing to basically think of a future outside of fossil fuels. And therefore, the entire format was a bit of a different dimension, and it was more a certain level of trust that people were negotiating about the different topics and sharing these different experiences, which I found quite vital. In total, the present members basically still were comprising 30% of the global fossil fuel demand and 20% of the global fossil fuel supply. Supply being basically oil, gas, and coal fields, and demand being basically electricity usage from coal, gas, and oil elements. Nevertheless, in total, it was 1/3 of global GDP that was being present, and more than 1,000 stakeholders participated those days in dialogue within Colombia. The conference basically took place, especially in the last 2 days of April, 28th and 29th of April, marked here on the right-hand side in the illustration. But we had, which is, I think, first of a kind, several different pre-conferences among different groups of civil society or the academic dialogue, which took place the days before that. And the important idea behind this was that, for example, the academics such as myself would meet for 2 days to basically streamline our academic findings, to then hand over these main important findings into the high-level dialogue. Something similar was done by the so-called People's Assembly, the NGO Assembly, or the Trade Union Dialogue, which would take place a couple of days before the conference and then hand over their findings to the high-level segment. And in the high-level segment, it was then especially political decision makers basically discussing the different elements. I will now first talk a bit about the methodological funnel or the process of how the final document that was published last month in June 2026 basically came together. First of all, it was clear that there would be this bigger conference happening. So from the beginning onwards, the conference organizers offered to other countries, to other organizations, to basically come up with different topics, proposals for themes, and these things could be handed in through the organizers before the conference already took place. So it was organizations registering for the event, but also submitting basically documents, findings, so that the knowledge base was as wide as possible throughout these different things. Through these different elements, there were certain virtual dialogues which happened already before the conference itself, enabling also participants to be involved within the process if they couldn't make it physically to Colombia. And position papers were basically defined and written and reviewed within the weeks before the conference. So stages 1 to 4, so to speak, took place before the real conference in person happened. We then had these in-person chapters that I had just described from the different groups of society the days before the conferences. Each of these segments then was able to also select some spokespersons that would represent them within the main conference. I was, for example, also a participant of the main conference, but I was not one of the 2 spokespersons. One of my co-hosts of projects, Andrea Cardoso, who's a professor at the University in Santa Marta, she was one of the spokespersons, and she was then the one presenting the academic findings to the high-level segment, which took place on the 28th and 29th of April. And then basically there was a conference outcome, which was a very short synthesis report published directly at the end of the conference. But then 2 months afterwards, basically in June, there was a more profound report being published, which includes some additional findings and basically is the final document, so to speak, now of this process until now. I would first start now with the findings from the academic sphere. So if I'm saying the academic, then it's of course impossible to condense so much information by scientists from all continents of the world, from all disciplines that we know of, and from different experience levels. So we had people specialized in gender aspects, we had engineers there, we had people from Asia, we had people from Europe. So we had a lot of expertise, and we tried to formalize some overarching findings which we thought were most important for political decision makers to be aware of when basically meeting at the high-level segment. We basically identified 3 different elements. The first one was you need to overcome the economic dependence of fossil fuels. So if countries keep on being dependent on oil, gas, and coal, then it's very difficult for them to basically shift to alternatives. So therefore, you need different elements to address these aspects. The first element that we stated was, therefore, you need to develop a holistic government plan to transition away from fossil fuels and to dismantle the legal, the financial, and the political barriers, which basically result from the existing fossil fuel lock-in and the entrenchment, meaning basically the alignment sometimes of political decision makers and the industry. Therefore, we recommended that you would need roadmaps which should include specific milestones for this transition away from fossil fuels, and that these should be anchored in science and justice, but also including the international coordination as well as national planning. So we don't want international scientists to tell countries in the global south what to do, but we need to incorporate this international dimension with the national planning, with the national expertise from the countries that are most affected. The second topic, which is more addressing specifically just transition, and we state that proactively we need to protect the livelihoods and the workers through early retraining, skill development, and community and regional redevelopment, which should be based on dialogue and therefore can ensure the economic benefit and that the costs of the transition are distributed fairly among all the people. The third one is speaking about how to basically communicate such a fair, transparent, and evidence, so science-based policies. And we see in a lot of research that normally public is in favor of climate action. Public is not opposing climate action. So therefore, political decision makers sometimes have to be more daring to basically do also what the society would want them to do. And on the contrary, we sometimes see that lobby organizations are able, through misinformation and disinformation, to implement false narratives within their agenda, such as fossil carbon capture and storage, or different elements of hydrogen as a false narrative, nuclear sometimes as a false narrative, etc. And therefore, we would more favor banning fossil fuel advertisement or restricting lobbying to basically enable a fair and better communication policy. We were also trying to link health aspects with climate aspects, and therefore wanted to state in the fourth aspect that we want to appeal to human values and the well-being to convey the need to transition. If we include the health aspects within the transition discussion, we realize that phasing out fossil fuels will save us so much money that otherwise is needed due to the health impacts of burning fossil fuels, that basically such a transition away from fossil fuels can be an economic necessity, especially also in countries in the global south, and can bring a lot of additional wealth and well-being to these countries. The second element is focusing on how to transform the supply and the demand. Item number 5 is specifically, we should take immediate measures to prevent future emissions. So sometimes we're focusing very much on the existing power plant, for example, but sometimes it's important to focus especially on, let's at least stop building new fossil infrastructure, so therefore, let's not focus on closing a power plant, but instead at least focus on not building any new power plants. No new fossil infrastructure, meaning also LNG terminals, meaning pipelines, etc., etc. We would mandate deep, legally binding cuts to methane emissions in the energy sector, because methane emissions are even worse than carbon CO2 emissions. We need to accelerate electrification of energy end users, for example, in the transportation sector, and this is very important for many different countries. Item number 6 is the topic of how to implement this, for example, through carbon pricing, as this has been very successful in different regions, as carbon pricing is a tool to internalize the external costs of CO2. However, carbon pricing alone is a necessary tool, but it's not sufficient just by itself to basically address the issues. So we should combine it with other aspects, such as also revenue recycling. So using the revenues from the carbon pricing to basically redistribute some of the costs back to those families that otherwise cannot afford carbon neutral energy usage. We should establish enabling standards, and we have to monitor the requirements for fossil fuel transition targets and timetables. And this is important because otherwise targets are not being met if we don't monitor them in a public and coherent way. We should implement harmonized fossil fuel supply levies to incentivize demand shifts and fund just transition. So through this, we could be able also through fossil fuel supply levy to collect some money, which can be used to basically redirect a more just transition. Speaking about finances, topic number 9 focuses on the aspects that central banks' financial and price stability is able to reduce the financing costs of clean energy, electrification, and enabling infrastructure. In many countries in the global south, it is very expensive to loan money, and therefore, for example, the construction of renewable energy plants is very challenging simply because the interest rates are too high, and therefore central banks or other countries could basically give guarantees and therefore make this much cheaper. We would basically advise to have more international cooperation on how to transition away from fossil fuels within the UNFCCC process, but also surrounding the UNFCCC process, like for example with conference. The TAFF conference, as we call it, is not in it. It's a supplementary element of the COP conference. It's not a substitute, but it helps and eases the entire process. It is important that, coming from an academic background, all forms of knowledge and development are important to be included in just transition. This could be academic knowledge, this could be indigenous knowledge, and there's all different kinds of knowledge that we need to basically solve the problems ahead. We need to realign also the international legal frameworks. Here we're speaking, for example, the barriers from the investor-state dispute settlements, which basically sometimes make a challenge for transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energies. These were still complex, but tried by us to be relatively simple and profound 12 findings from the academic conference, which can also be downloaded at Energy Transition Science, which we were handing over basically to the policymakers. This was before the conference took place or just ahead of the conference. In the aftermath of the conference now, there's even more documents being texted, and I'm just wanting to cite one of these publications, which is focusing only on this topic of just transition. So if I was talking before about these 12 insights, then there's one element, for example, topic number 2, proactively protect livelihoods and workers through early retraining, skill development, and community and regional redevelopment. And for this subtopic, basically some organizations, including Trajax and my university, were involved in basically having several breakout sessions during the conference and then drafting reports afterwards on the so-called key insights on labor reconversion, just transition, and economic diversification. So these are some aspects that we think are most important, based also, once again, on science, based on lessons learned from other countries in the last decades. So this is not just pure ivory tower talking, but basically hands-on experience, which we are trying to navigate and then therefore make accessible for other regions to not make the same mistakes that were done in the past by other countries. We have seen regarding the findings, the first one, that we need to institutionalize mechanisms for social dialogue which respect the territorial realities and are implemented early on and very consistently throughout the decision-making process. So it really needs to fit also the local context. Number 2, we need to undertake proactive worker-centered planning that accounts for informal as well as reproductive labor and is grounded in the aforementioned mechanisms for social dialogue. So it's not just the formal workers working in the coal mine, but especially the informal sector. It's the reproductive labor, the care work that is happening around coal mines, for example, that needs to be accounted for when thinking about the future. If we do not account for the existing inequalities, then we risk that a new system might replicate the existing inequalities. So therefore, the transition is a chance to create more equality, but it doesn't come automatically. Number 3, we need to support the access to and the capacity building for credible and context-specific transition modeling and open analytical tools. So we have quantitative and qualitative tools to model the future and to basically see if we do this, most likely this would happen. But we need to make them context-specific, because you cannot simply use a tool that was successfully used in South Africa and apply it to Colombia and thinking that it would work, because it's a very different context. Number 4, you need to undertake proactive, sequenced, and context-specific strategies for economic diversification, with continuous monitoring of social impacts and adaptive planning. So one of the important aspects, you need to monitor basically what is happening and then basically also adapt your strategy if things are going in the wrong way. You should strengthen the collaborative governance across scales and regions, including South-to-South partnerships to support the territorial delivery of transition pathways. We've had a lot of exchange within Europe, for example, between Germany and France and the UK. We have had less exchange between Indonesia, South Africa, and Colombia and India on how to phase out fossil fuels. So this is something to be done in the future. Number 6, we should embed the justice concerns within transition finance mechanisms, debt-related arrangements, and international tax cooperation. A lot of countries in the Global South have so high debts already that it's very difficult for them to manage any kind of transition because they don't have the financial capacities. So this is something that we need to talk within this context. Number 7, we need to integrate these just transition principles across the current multiple processes, such as, for example, the COP30 presidency roadmap process, and ensure that they bring practical contributions to the just transitions on the ground. The ideas which I just showed are just some of the so-called solutions for just transition that were collected by the presidencies, meaning by the Colombian and the Dutch government. So what you can see here is just some screenshots from the website I took this morning. Until now, it has 12 chapters, 258 curated solutions. They have 1,200 contributions which they were received, and they basically grouped them around 3 thematic pillars. The 3 thematic pillars that were also present across the entire conferences are the 3 pillars here at the bottom. The first one is overcoming economic dependence on fossil fuels. The second one, transforming fossil fuel supply and demand. And the third one being international framework and climate governance. These were also the 3 pillars, how we then arranged our academic recommendations to them. And you can see up on the top right button, these are basically the different chapters that were identified by the presidency, which basically form different sectors, such as, for example, the academic chapter, Afro-descendant people, peasant and farming communities, etc., etc. So a lot of different chapters, and you can see how many specific solutions within the different pillars have been proposed by different organizations. Most of these contributions having been submitted before the start of the conference so that they could be incorporated within the process. However, the transition away from fossil fuel conference, it's not a one-time only thing, but it's just more the start of a process of what is happening. So therefore, this is just a start, I would say. One of the overarching findings, or it's not a profound finding, but it's more a wrap-up of the status quo where we are and just showing the importance of to continue this process, is that around 75% of all the global greenhouse gas emissions come from fossil fuels today. So therefore, stopping the burning of fossil fuels will eliminate more than 3/4 of all emissions. So therefore, this is the biggest element that we have to tackle. You cannot reach climate neutrality without phasing out fossil fuels. It's just very logic. Also, there's a solution. For most sectors, renewable energies can be easily replaced by renewable energy. And we see that, for example, renewable energy capacity has been basically seen double digits increases every year. We see a plus 50% growth and capacity within 2 years from 2023 to 2025. And already all the additional new energy demand in the last years was always taken up by renewable energy. And it is especially countries in the Global South, also especially India or China, who are basically leading these pipelines. Some overarching issues that were identified not just by the academics, but also by the political decision makers and stressed by them in their report was 6 challenges. The first one is many countries struggle because of a fiscal and economic dependence. Because these governments, their revenue is partly tied to fossil fuel production and exports, which might be due to taxes. It might be because some of the companies are state-owned companies. It might be because of the jobs linked to the fossil fuel. It depends a bit on each country. Might be the export income, etc. So therefore, there's different reasons, but there is a strong economic link between fossil fuels and the economic situation in many countries. Many countries, as mentioned, are debt constrained because they already have so many debts. They have very limited fiscal space to invest in any alternatives and are depending on international investors, which comes with additional challenges. Local investors have a very high cost of capital, which makes it very difficult for them to invest in renewable energies because they are more capital intensive. Renewable energies, such also as electric vehicles, are more expensive when buying them at the beginning. The usage of them for the next 20 years will probably be cheaper, but at the beginning you need high upfront investments and therefore you need cheap capital costs. The technological constraints are unevenly distributed. Some countries have very advanced technologies, including Europe, including US or China. Some other countries do not really have access to the newest technologies and therefore would need technical assistance. Trade-related issues have become very important, as we saw in the last years, especially with the second administration of Trump. Trade wars emerging, making it very difficult to trade any kind of resources or technologies and making it more difficult. We've seen in the last years an uneven benefit sharing, and even though the switch from fossil to renewable energies will reduce costs, this does not automatically mean that everybody will be a winner within this transition. So we need to think about benefit sharing, that especially those people that need it the most profit from it. The political decision makers therefore came up with 10 main findings, which are the key messages that they want to highlight, which they have taken from all the insights from the academic sphere as well as from civil society, and which they want to keep on working for the next years. The first element is a defining priority of our time. So basically, they have acknowledged that fossil fuels need to be phased out and that we cannot reach the climate targets without it. So therefore, they agree what science has been saying the last decades already. They also state that this process of the transition away from fossil fuels in Santa Marta has been a coalition of the willing, a coalition of the doers, and that this has been a very productive setup, which they would like to continue because it was a safe space where people could speak about their doubts, their questions on how to basically do the transition. There was not a question of do we phase out fossil fuels, it was just a question how do we do it the best, the most fair, the most just way. So this was a change in the narrative. They also acknowledged that we do have favorable conditions because renewables become cheap. However, we would need stronger governance, which is basically a to-do, especially also for political decision makers in some countries to basically step up. Number 4, it is not just a fuel swap. So it's not just replacing one technology with another, but in many cases, it is a full system transformation. We need a combination of different tools. We need different actors. It's basically a power transformation because different actors get power. And therefore, it's a systematic transition which comes with a lot of different challenges that we need to incorporate. Therefore, number 5, we need to coordinate this planning across supply and demand, and it cannot be just planned top-down, but we need to incorporate top-down and bottom-up measures at the same time. Rights-based and territorially grounded, because local aspects, especially if the regions affected are owned by indigenous communities, need to be incorporated, and we need to have inclusive development, incorporating locally led solutions which include, for example, also indigenous knowledges. Domestic action from some countries going forward, or local action, even if sometimes not on the national level only, as well as international cooperation, can work together and are also needed to keep on pushing the agenda, even though some countries or some regions might sometimes step out of the consortium and then hopefully might realign again with the next election to basically work on this phase out of fossil fuels. To overcome these economic dependencies, we need to use tailored solutions. We can base these solutions on lessons learned from other countries, but we always need to adapt them to the local characteristics. The entire process, as mentioned, that TAFF is proposing is within and beyond the UNFCCC. So we need the UNFCCC, but there's a lot of other initiatives, including BOGA, PPCA, CETP, and even more organizations which basically deal with important aspects which can be incorporated and should not be, which are complementary to one another. The last finding, I think, is that the conference basically summarized that such a world beyond fossil fuels is possible, and that it's definitely worthwhile to work on this topic, especially being aware of the costs of the climate crisis that we are seeing day to day in many countries already arising. For the next future, therefore, there are 5 different pathways that the conference organizers in their report in June basically highlighted. The first one is basically we need collective action, so global partnership and sustained TAFF process and methodologies for the next years. We need such a system coherence across these different conferences, so the spirit of Santa Marta basically needs to be duplicated across the next initiatives. It's not just a one-time thing, but it needs to be streamlined. We will need national roadmaps which should be developed within the next years for carbon, for countries which still have a lot of coal, oil, or gas, and they could design and strengthen the science and right-based transition roadmaps. Finance and debt, as I mentioned, is an important aspect to overcome these macroeconomics challenges in many countries, and trade alignment can basically help if producers and consumers are being aligned towards a more decarbonized trade balances, so shifting from fossil fuels to trading other more carbon neutral technologies or elements. For this next year, basically, we will see that there's now a handover by Colombia and the Netherlands, who basically hand over the hosting of the conference to the next 2 countries, being Tuvalu and Ireland. Tuvalu being another island state very strongly affected by the climate crisis, and Ireland are a coordinated group. The main conference will take place next year in Tuvalu. However, there will be the pre-conferences taking place in Ireland, and therefore making it more easy to meet in Ireland, as it is more difficult, also geographically speaking and logistically speaking, to get hundreds or thousands of people to Tuvalu, as it's a very small state which basically has 1 hotel, honestly speaking. And for the future, there will be these 3 work streams which will be launched, which basically should enable the continued engagement with civil society, with practitioners, with academics, to basically have a deeper analysis which is grounded on science. This entire process is still linked to the COP30 activation group, to the UNFCCC, the IPCC, etc., and the other organizations. There were the pre-COP talks had taken place last month also in Bonn, and the Santa Marta process was one of the most important elements also discussed within the Bonn process, so it is happening in accordance with the COP process. The second conference, as mentioned, will be then co-hosted basically in 2027, most likely in autumn, and then condensed in such a second round of dialogue to then be continued in 2028 by another country. Basically, as a last slide and information, just how can we transit towards a more social, environmental, just world? This is something that also we within Trajects, one of the global centers financed by the DAAD, are working on through our different formats that we have. So feel free to look at our website to basically look at more seminars that we have. We have a lot of scholarship holders working on a master's or PhD level to form independent solution, which we will then try to submit also through this TAFF process to basically enable the science-based discussions on this topic. So I want to thank you once more for taking the time to listen to me instead of the minister. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions that we can then answer. And I will stop now the sharing of the slides, but I could go back to some of the slides if you have specific questions to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pao-Yu Oei, for this insightful presentation. There have been some comments in the chat. And thank you to all of you who have been commenting and sending your questions. Please use the chat for this. I will start reading some of the questions that we have there so you can answer them. The first question is from Max Schmidt, and he's asking, are you aware of any research that shows a direct link between high fossil fuel import dependency on country level that reduces and reduced access to climate and sustainable finance on good terms?
Okay, it's challenging because I can't see the question, so it's difficult for me to. Could you repeat it, just the main essence, please? Sorry.
Are you aware of any research that shows a direct link between high fossil fuel import dependency and reduce access to climate and sustainable finance on good terms?
Yeah. The quick answer is no. So I don't have one academic paper in mind that has basically found out this causation. Reduced access to. I think in general, what we see with respect to this challenge of not having enough sustainable finance is that nearly all countries in the global south struggle with simply having relatively high interest costs if they want to invest in renewable energies or if they want to invest in anything else. So the high interest cost is not something which is linked only to carbon neutral technologies, but it's more a general issue that finance costs are more expensive in other countries in the global south. The challenge is here that investors sometimes then don't know so much about renewable technologies. So then there comes an extra interest rate markup because they are uncertain whether these renewable technologies will really work, whether the money will come back within the next 20 years and these things. So it's a combination of anyhow bad financial situations in some countries in combination with conservative investors not yet fully being convinced of the financial benefits of the transition. And it would therefore, that's why we then need the securities. What we have is, of course, the additional challenge that, for example, some countries that are struggling with the transition, such as, for example, South Africa. South Africa borrowed a lot of money to build some fossil fuel infrastructure, being basically coal power plants. This did not work out the right way, so they are now very much strongly indebted because of their fossil fuel investment. Due to this, the ranking of South Africa has been valued very badly within international finances. So now for all future debts, they have to pay even more higher interest rates. And if South Africa will be less able to sell their coal to other countries because of people not buying coal anymore, their debt ratio will increase even more. So sometimes if you are very dependent on fossil fuels and you are trying to phase out fossil fuels, this will not benefit your debt quota, and therefore this is an additional challenge. Some insights, if not the perfect answer, maybe to this question.
Thank you for the answer. And then Daniel is asking, how do you expect the dynamics around the call for the new international legal instrument on fossil fuels to play out looking ahead to the second TAFF conference?
I think it is challenging. So, for example, one of the aspects of the TAFF conference was that there is no strong legal binding document that came out of the conference. This was also never the aim of the conference. It is very difficult always to have anything legally binding on the international agenda. We have the Paris Agreement, which was ratified by nearly all countries in the world, but also the Paris Agreement is not fully legally binding. So if a country is not complying with it, if the US is deciding to step out of it, nothing big is happening. If you would want to implement any legal binding document, many countries would simply not sign it. So it's very difficult. And therefore, the entire process of the TAFF is not designed in a way to force anyone to do something, but it's more, let's encourage people to go forward. Let's encourage the first movers to brag about how good they are, how well they are doing. And then let's hope that some countries are then following them because they realize, oh, it's actually a positive transition and you can do it. And the outcome is better than not doing anything. And so therefore, I do not expect for the second TAFF conference to come up with any kind of legal instrument. The first conference basically came up with a policy document, which was only authored by the Colombian and by the Dutch government, simply because it would also not have been possible to fully negotiate it with all other countries, because negotiating a tax is much more complicated and needs many days, and then it's more difficult to reach a full consensus. In that case, in Santa Marta, more than 50 countries talked about topics, and then 2 countries sat down and tried to condense the main findings from their point of view, trying to incorporate everybody's perspectives, but they didn't ask all the other 50 countries to co-sign it. So therefore, it was a much easier process, but therefore it was also a more realistic finding. And all the other country representatives that I spoke to, they are fine with the documents, and they agree that it is basically giving them some ideas and some vision on how to continue, but it doesn't restrict them too much. So therefore, I think that the second report would be something similar. In that case, then drafted basically as recommendations by Tuvalu and Ireland based on science-based, continuing this aftermath. They might also be co-authored by Colombia and Netherlands if they continue to be within this format of the four, or it might be only the two new ones. This remains to be seen.
Perfect. And then we have a comment and question from Al-Shaima Hamdi Tawos from Egypt, who is working at the Egyptian Electricity Transmission Company on environmental and social planning for transmission and renewable energy projects. Like a project the person is working on showed that economically dispatched cross-border interconnections combined with storage and flexible operation can significantly reduce operational costs, curtailment, reserve scarcity, and reliability risk under high renewable penetration. From your experience with fossil fuel phase-out and just transition research, what do you see as the biggest institutional barrier to moving from bilateral electricity trade toward integrated regional markets?
So first of all, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the work that you are doing basically on the Egyptian energy market. I think this is very necessary. We have done similar experiences for the European energy market in the last 15 years, so to speak. And we basically started off 15 to 20 years ago in Europe with some scenarios where there were visions of so-called desert tech, which would be like a lot of PV installations in northern part of Africa and a lot of hydropower and wind in Scandinavia, and then basically PV from the south, wind from the northern part of Europe, and everything fueling the rest of Europe, everything super interconnected with electric superhighways, like direct current, DC grids, and this is something which is techno-economically possible and probably the cheapest solution. These were basically the drafts, which were also in line with the agenda of the European Commission at that point in time. However, 10 years later, the reality was that it was far too difficult to implement something such as this, because even though, for example, Europe is one European Union, within Europe, you have so many different countries with different agendas. And that starts off with a lot of different countries wanting to be electrically independent from their neighbors. So countries didn't want to be dependent only on electricity imports from Scandinavia nor from northern part of Africa. So therefore, countries wanted to be independent. France wanted to push nuclear, Germany wanted to push renewables, Poland wanted to push coal. So you had political incentives, in some cases also entrenched industries in favor of a certain industry branch, and therefore modifying national policy making and making it more difficult for these things. Germany was basically also, for example, pushing forward renewables and building especially renewables in the northern part of Germany, and we have an increased renewable or electricity demand in the southern part of Germany. So electricity needed to be transported from the northern part of Germany to the southern part of Germany. But we were not good enough in building enough electricity lines across Germany to basically enable this electricity transport. As you're an electrical engineer, you're aware of loop flows of electricity, which therefore caused electricity not only being transported from northern Germany to southern Germany, but electricity going also through Poland and through Czech Republic. And basically the increased installation of renewables, especially in northern part of Europe, led to congestion and basically bottlenecks in the electricity grid in Poland and in Czech Republic. So therefore, if it is not streamlined across different countries, some countries might face additional challenges, additional costs, additional increases for these things. We've seen the same question now in Scandinavia, connecting Scandinavia more closer to the rest of the continental Europe. would basically reduce electricity costs in the rest of Europe, but it would increase electricity costs in Scandinavia, which is why people in Norway are not so keen on basically being connected to the rest of Europe. So whenever you basically do a kind of transition, there will be winners and losers, and then it's on political decision makers to basically take some money from the winners and give it to the losers in a certain way to reach a political consensus where everybody's on board. My findings.
Thank you for sharing the answer. And then we are moving to Alejandro Gomez, who asks, how does the approach in this conference differentiate from that of the COP?
The biggest difference, I think, is the setup. At the COP, basically all the countries could come, and a lot of different other organizations can come as well. So a lot of civil society organizations, a lot of industries are being present. So you end up with tens of thousands of people being present there. It becomes super expensive. You can't find a hotel, and some organizations cannot come because you cannot afford a hotel with costs of 500, 600 euros per night. In Santa Marta, we were a bit more than 1,000 people, so it was much smaller. It was still big, but it's much smaller at least. And some countries that normally are just blocking the negotiations were simply not invited. Other countries decided not to join because they didn't really like the topics that much. So therefore, it is just those that are really interested in forming the transition, being active and being present in such a room. And this changes the entire narrative. Because imagine there are different countries, some African countries, for example, that were present in Colombia, which normally would be a bit more neutral. They're not too stringent on climate policies because they don't have the financial means, but they're not blocking. Now, in Colombia, they were also there, but there was no negative blocking initiative there. So they were neutral countries, but therefore, as everybody else was very positive, so to speak, they suddenly had the feeling, oh, everybody here really believes this is possible. Well, maybe it is possible then. So they are then following basically this positive narrative and being more open to basically also forming this kind of transition. And it's, I think, a bit more similar to the origin of the first COPs, which were much smaller, where it was more easy to talk to people, where people were a bit more positive, and knowledge sharing was one of the main important elements. So therefore, I think it was a small sign of hope going in the right direction. But once again, it is not it is supposed to happen in addition to the existing COPs. So it should not replace the COPs. We still need the big COPs where everybody is present, but sometimes it's helpful to basically meet in a smaller group to discuss how to proceed for the next steps.
Perfect. Then we have a question from Laura Daniela. We often hear commitments, proposals, but putting them into practice can be difficult. How can we implement and adapt to local realities, especially in the Global South?
Of course, it depends always on the local aspect. I think one of the importance is, of course, it's difficult to implement something within your country without the support of your national government. So you need a government in favor of different things. If your national government is not in favor, sometimes it can be also sufficiently beneficial to have at least your local government in favor of different aspects of basically going one step further, of first of all acknowledging the problem, stating that you want to phase out fossil fuels, that you want to build renewables, even if you sometimes have to say, I don't have the finances yet, but at least you're saying, this is my strategy, this is my plan, and then identify what it is that it is missing. And once you have identified what is missing, then to find a strategy on how to get it. Like, do you miss the expertise? Do you miss the investors? Do you miss the workforce? Do you miss the knowledge? Do you miss the finances? Like, what is missing? And then trying to find one of these bigger organizations to help you in getting this. As I showed, there's this website now by the TAFF, which basically has all these knowledge sets, so to speak. So there's knowledge information out there. There's a lot of experts which could advise you on the different topics. There's a lot of case studies which have been analyzed already. There are some roadmaps for some countries which were developed already. Some countries don't have a roadmap yet on how to transition away from fossil fuels. For these countries, the roadmaps should be done within the next years by different organizations. So therefore, it is first of all for your country region, try to analyze the status quo, what needs to happen, who needs to do something, and how do we persuade or enable these actors to basically move forward.
Our next question is from Open. With collaboration between countries being noted as a factor that will contribute to the transition of fossil fuels, in what ways, beyond academic, have countries collaborated to foster this transition? And if there is no evidence of this, do you know how they can collaborate?
I have to read the question. It is could be not as effective. Basically, there have been it is very often that, for example, also that fossil fuel also infrastructure goes across borders. So it's very often that coal beds are not just in one country, but in an area across countries, that coal or oil and gas is being transported from country A to country B, is being then exported from country B. So fossil fuel infrastructure is often across borders and is affecting different territories. Very often the fact that, for example, one country is phasing out fossil fuel can influence the neighboring countries automatically. It is often that workers also move in between different regions. And there have been basically a lot of organizations beyond this conference where countries have worked together. There is, for example, BOGA, which is the Beyond Oil and Gas Initiative, which are countries that have signed that they want to basically phase out oil and gas. There is the PPCA, which is Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is basically similar to BOGA, but not on oil and gas, but instead on coal, where countries have once again signed that they want to phase out coal. So there's different initiatives signed by different countries. In some cases, it's not only countries, but also sometimes regional groups who basically are in favor of these different things. There is the Fossil Fuel Phase-Out Treaty, which is basically a new UN treaty that is being proposed, where the idea is basically that people countries signing this treaty would agree that they want to stop the usage of fossil fuels because this is bad for society, humanity. So there is different organizations and formats where countries can join to proclaim that they are in line with this target. And through these organizations, they can get access to additional information, to additional expertise that can advise them on how to go forward. In some cases, there can be also limited financial support through these organizations. So it depends a bit on a case-by-case situation, what is the best elements. And some countries have been active in multiple multi-nation formats, but nevertheless, what I wanted to stress is that we still need more South-South exchange, because a lot of these organizations come forward by dominated or originally organized by countries from the global North, and pure South-South exchange formats are a bit lacking, I would say.
Thank you. Moving forward with Noor Al-Harab-Sheikh, hopefully I say it in the right way, Associate Professor in Water and Environment at Balaka Applied University, Jordan, is asking, given that Jordan relies on imports for over 90% of its energy, what scientific frameworks must the country develop to scale up its solar and oil shale infrastructure safely?
So I think one of the first things is, if your country is importing 90% of its energy, this means that basically diversifying your energy mix and going basically more towards renewables, being photovoltaic and wind, increases the energy security of your country and therefore also eases the financial possibilities of your country. Because countries such as Jordan will be spending a lot of their money basically also on paying oil and gas, basically entering its territory. And you would most likely have relatively cheap PV costs, so to speak, because of the good PV availability. I'm not so sure about the wind availability in some of the area, which could be also quite good. And within these setups, I think it would be important to basically at first also look a bit at neighboring regions or at regions with a similar geographical setup with respect to similar solar irradiation, similar wind potential, and see and how far they have mastered these different things and which policy instruments they have, for example, also used to encourage investors to basically build PV industry within the ground, and to identify also what is the bottleneck at the moment. Is there no investors? Is there not enough space? Is there not enough finances? Is there not enough workforce? Is there not enough electricity grid to then basically connect these solar infrastructures to the demand centers? So basically identify once again the bottlenecks for your case, identify the positive elements that were found in similar cases to reduce these bottlenecks, to speak to experts, and also to try to inform the population of what it is that you want to do, because you need a political majority to push this forward. And sometimes if you can't through the political angle, it is going through civil society and through the public acceptance. And if public acceptance and if the population understands that shifting from fossil fuel to renewable will reduce their energy costs, then they would also be more in favor. They will not protest against renewable energy installations, and they would also put pressure on the governments to basically push forward policies more inclined to ease this transition.
Perfect. We have a question from Ali Usman. I'm not sure if I understand it correctly, but can we use thermoelectric materials due to the heat waves all around the planet for such issue?
Could you say the name again? Sorry, I didn't get the name.
Ali Usman.
Or read out the question, please, again. Sorry.
Can we use thermoelectric materials due to the heat waves all around the planet for such issue?
I'm also not 100%
sure.
sure, but I fully understand the question. So in general, what we see is, of course, what we see is with the climate crisis is that we see more extreme weather events happening. We see more extreme heats. We see also extreme droughts. We see extreme cold periods. So different extreme elements. So therefore, we need to basically, we need to be aware that, for example, in the past, we would differentiate between climate mitigation and climate adaptation, where mitigation basically targets, let's try to reduce emissions, and adaptation was like, let's try to adapt our society to meet the rising temperatures and the rising challenges that we face. We are now at a time where we have to do both. So we have to do all we can in trying to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels so that the climate crisis doesn't get worse. Nevertheless, we are already within the middle of the climate crisis, or at the beginning of the climate crisis, but it's already there. So we have these extreme heats. We have temperatures of more than 40 degrees across Europe. We have temperatures of sometimes more than 50 degrees in countries such as India. We have thousands of people dying. So we have to basically change and adapt infrastructure and also living patterns in a way that people adapt to these extreme temperatures, being it extreme heat waves or extreme droughts in different areas. And especially some people will suffer from it. In some cases, of course, we can try to use some of these energies through, for example, if we build photovoltaic installations, we are benefiting from the increased radiation and these things. But nevertheless, the most important is proper adaptation of these things.
Perfect, thank you. And now from Irini Kikwai, the question is the aspect of governance and policy. So specifically is what strategies in this regard proved effective to ensure uptake of the transition by policymakers, and what were the trade-offs?
So I think this is also it's a very big question. So therefore, there's not one answer because it depends a bit on the different aspects. It is also from an academic point of view, always very difficult to say in the aftermath always what worked and what didn't work, because you don't know what would have happened unless you don't know the counterfactual. So for example, if you look at Germany, we have had now 60 years of experience of phasing out coal. We know that some areas do better than others, but we don't know what would have happened if we had gone for a different strategy. So what we realize is in general that areas that at some point accepted that they needed to transition and they then proactively went forward and tried to find alternatives, that they ended up in a better state than some other areas which kept on trying to cling on fossil capacities for too long. They didn't want to think about any new strategy. And then at some point when the economics became too hard, when companies became bankrupt, they had not thought of any plan B. They had no strategy of what to do after. Their skill force was not diversified enough to shift to any other area, and there was no money left to invest in any new additional startups or something like this. So therefore, it is important that governments, as well as industries, as well as regions, as long as they still have some financial power, need to start actively thinking of a plan B, so that once they're being forced or once that the technology is viable, they can then enable this shift. And it is important also to understand that in some cases it's been done more top-down, in some cases it's been more organized bottom-up. This depends very much also how countries are being governed. Germany has federal countries and is relatively decentrally organized. France, for example, is very centrally organized by Paris. Could be different for many other different regions and countries for different, not stating that one is better than the other. If it's more decentrally organized, it is easier to adapt the strategy to the local needs. At the same time, there might be a lot of competition in between regions, which region should get the money. Sometimes more knowledge is existing on the top-down level in some countries, so it really depends a bit on the issue.
We have some couple of more questions, and this one is from Dr. Kenneth Tibaruiza from Zimbabwe for Beyond Universities, and the question is, why is that there is so much research solutions on how to transition Africa from fossil fuels, yet Africa is lagging behind in transition?
I would say that there is a lot of research. There's a lot of research already on different countries in the African continent. There's even more research on countries in Europe. So we still have more bottlenecks or lack of research on the African continent than any other continent. So we still need more research, first of all. Nevertheless, even though we sometimes would know what is needed, we still have a lack of finances to really implement a transition in the African continent, simply because the financial challenges are bigger. If you want to build a PV plant, you get an interest rate of 15% in Africa, and in Europe, you get an interest rate of 5%. So basically, you have a 10% more interest rate. So therefore, this is why it is more challenging to do this in these countries, even though the technical availability of PV potential is much better in the African continent. So there's a lot of room basically to become even better in the next years.
I'm sorry to interrupt now, but we are a bit of the end of our session today. So unfortunately, we cannot answer all the questions posted in the chat, but thank you very much, all of you, for the lively discussion. And also, of course, thank you very much for the insightful and interesting lecture, dear Pao-Yu Oei. And also, Grace, thank you, of course, very much for moderating the session today. And to all the participants who were interested in the video or also on the slides, we will inform you as soon as the video of today's lecture has been published on our YouTube channels. And if you enjoyed today's session, we would be delighted to welcome you all again on 20th of October. Professor Guy Midgley, Director of the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, will give a lecture on climate change and the fragility of abundance of perspective from Africa. So I think it's like a good bridge to our next session, that we have the Africa topic in our last question. So thank you very much. Have a nice day and goodbye. Hope to see you soon in our next lecture. Bye-bye.
Bye bye, everyone.